Coverage of the courts is fundamentally different than coverage of most other policy-related political institutions.
There are not many criminal justice system reporters. They're mostly crime reporters. And it's very hard to cover crime if you piss off the DA or the police chief. Just makes it really difficult to do the rest of what you've been tasked with doing.
And that's just really led to our work being so localized and really based on what people have connections to.
And as we have seen, when the corporate side bottomed out, the vestigial appendage of the civic democratic side was dropped like a bad habit.
What keeps me up at night is the fact that you cannot have a functional democracy without a robust free press, and nobody right now is willing to pay for that. Nobody's willing to pay for it.
If anyone in the audience has $1 million, I think you look nice today.
And so this is fundamentally fused with those capitalist corporate prerogatives of needing to sell papers, needing to keep ad revenue up, needing to basically jettison the civic function of a free press.
My unending ability to still get pissed off about what I'm seeing and not ever get really used to it. And I find that to be kind of a bummer, because it would feel, it gets to you. It gets to you.
I have a white whale. If anyone in this audience knows how much Noah Feldman gets paid for his Bloomberg columns,
Which has made the work more difficult, but also really fascinating and enjoyable and creative and collaborative, because just the nature of the circumstances.
And I think of what we're doing as creation, not destruction, as trying to build something better. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be doing it. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Rosen. I'm a recent HLS graduate from the class of 2021. I'm a journalist, and I'll soon be starting a legal fellowship at the civil rights firm Gerstein Harrow. And I'm so excited to be moderating this fantastic panel about the corporate capture of legal journalism. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce our panelists with short bios that really won't do their careers justice. But of course, as we chat, more of their work and thoughts will sort of fill in the gaps. And I'm going to sort of try to sit in a way that allows me to talk to the virtual and in-person people. But if I tip over, I apologize. Okay, first we have Josie Duffy Rice. Josie is a journalist, writer, HLS graduate, and podcast host whose work is primarily focused on prosecutors, prisons, and other criminal justice issues. Twice a week, she hosts What a Day, Crooked Media's daily news podcast, and she's the creator and co-host of the podcast Justice in America. She's also the host and co-writer of the new investigative podcast Unreformed, which came out earlier this month, and whose first episode is just incredible. Until May 2021, she was president of The Appeal, a news outlet that publishes original journalism about the criminal justice system. She has written for basically every major publication in the country and is currently writing a book. Next, we have Jay Willis. Jay is another HLS graduate, and he's a writer and lawyer who covers courts, politics, and democracy. He's currently the editor-in-chief at Balls and Strikes, an outlet for progressive commentary on the legal system. Before that, he was a staff writer at GQ and a senior contributor to The Appeal, and he practiced law at firms in DC and Seattle. He's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many other publications. Next is Maximillian Alvarez. Maximillian is the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, the host of the Working People podcast, where he interviews workers about their lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles, and the author of the book, The Work of Living. He's also currently getting 2 PhDs at the same time in history and in comparative literature at the University of Michigan. I didn't even know it was possible to do that. It's pretty cool. And he was previously an editor at the Chronicle Review. Maximillian is also a prolific essayist whose work has appeared in many places, including The Baffler, Dissent, The Nation, The New Republic, and Boston Review. Finally, we have Sam Perri. Sam is a 3L at HLS and a founding member of The Flaw. Throughout law school, she has worked with the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, Root and Rebound, and the New Hampshire Public Defender. She's a student attorney with both Harvard's Criminal Justice Institute and the Prison Legal Assistance Project. And after graduation, she will be pursuing public defense and hopes to remain deeply connected to The Flaw. Thank you all so much for being here. I thought that where we could start is with some of the ideas that animate your work and animate the outlets that you've founded or led. Specifically, each of you have helped lead media organizations that seem to be responding in different ways to some problem or deficiency with some part of the media landscape, whether it's coverage of the courts or of criminal legal system or of working people or of corporate power, although obviously all of those things overlap. I'm wondering if you could each talk about sort of what that problem is specifically and how specifically you designed your organization or publication or just even the work that you do individually in response. And Jay, I thought I might start with you here since over at Balls and Strikes you've written about this very explicitly, what you and your colleagues sort of see as the problem with the way the courts are typically covered and how you conceived of Balls and Strikes as a solution.
For sure, and I'll start by again saying thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here, and thank you especially to Professor Hansen for having me back, and specifically for negotiating my fee for this, which is I get to take home one black and white portrait of a tenured professor. I get to choose which one, and I get to steal it, and there are no consequences. Noah Feldman, you're mine. So Balls and Strikes was formed out of a objectively correct belief that coverage of the courts is fundamentally different than coverage of most other policy-related political institutions. I think we've seen, like, especially during the Trump administration, wasn't always this way at first, but I do think that by the end of the Trump administration, you saw journalists covering Trump and the Republican Party from an often explicitly critical position. I thought that was great that a lot of journalists figured that shit out. I am disappointed in those that didn't, but you never see a similar shift in the way that legal media works. There is always a reverence for courts, for judges, for the institution. They are treated differently than politicians. And just like, think about the political stories you've read over the past couple weeks, coverage of someone like Kevin McCarthy or Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene. You would never see a mainstream legal commentator, an establishment legal commentator, sort of take the same explicitly critical angle on Brett Kavanaugh, on John Roberts, on Amy Coney Barrett. I think this tends to benefit primarily judges on the right, but it's equally true of judges on the left side of the ideological spectrum, who are just as likely to sort of repeat the common rhetoric about judges not being politicians. This was a major hobby horse of your friend and mine, Stephen Breyer, over the last couple of years of his career on the bench. So what Balls and Strikes does is just try and cover judges as sort of functionally the super legislature that they are in American government, and not as sort of the collection of wise and neutral law robots that I think a lot of reporters imagine them to be, and that a lot of legal elites, professors, big-name lawyers also hold in similar esteem.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Maximillian, can I bring you in here to talk about some of the same ideas with your projects and the Real News?
You can. Can folks hear me all right?
Yeah, definitely.
Sweet. Thanks so much for having us. It's a real honor to be here. And just to clarify, I already got the doctorate, so I'm not doing all of that at once. So that was a couple of years ago. I don't want to set unrealistic expectations here. So, okay, I'm gonna jump into this because I got a lot to say, but I want to be gracious to the rest of the panel. So I'm gonna try to kind of run through this. But I wanted to start just by kind of quickly refreshing all of our memories about the macro context of the protracted, wheezing death of American journalism as we have known it. You know, initially, since we are here, you know, to talk about corporate capture of everything, I had intended to more or less focus on this side of things in today's panel. But in prepping for this, I realized that there's actually something else, something more elusive that I really want to try to get to, but we can't get there without first reminding ourselves how dire the situation we're in now really is. Luckily, I get to pull from the brilliant work of other folks who have already studied this and summed it up more succinctly than I ever could. So to get things moving, I'm just going to speed read a quote from Bob McChesney and John Nichols's policy proposal through the Local Journalism Initiative to revitalize local news media in the United States. Here's what they write, quote, "The collapse of local journalism in the United States has its roots in the patterns of media consolidation that emerged in the final few decades of the 20th century, and then exploded with the emergence of the internet and social media in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It is now in its final stages, standing at the edge of the abyss after the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis that extended from it. Most communities in the United States are now at the point where there are virtually no paid journalists in competing newsrooms covering governance in a manner that is sufficient to sustain vibrant democratic institutions. Only in a handful of metropolitan areas does a semblance of semi-sufficient journalism remain, and it is invariably carried on by rapidly shrinking newsrooms that openly admit they are struggling to survive. In many communities, there are no paid reporters or newsrooms whatsoever. There were virtually no news deserts a generation ago or at any other time in American history, they write. Now they blanket the country. Advertising, which provided from 60 to 100% of the revenues for local newspapers, has abandoned journalism. Advertisers, including classified advertisers, were never wed to bankrolling newspapers or journalism. It was simply the price they had to pay to reach their target audience. With the internet's mind-boggling surveillance capacity, advertisers have found far more efficient, effective, and less expensive ways to market their products and services online. The traditional means of placing an ad in a specific medium is passé. Advertisers can now pay firms like Google or Facebook to locate potential members of their target audience wherever they may be online. Specific websites be damned. I'll cut the quote off there. You guys get the point. So that's where we are, right? To start and to put it bluntly, we are in an exceedingly fucked position, pardon my French, but in my opinion, it is not, and by no means, a unique position for working people in this country to be in. Every day, I talk to workers who are the living, breathing proof of the cruel absurdity of organizing the life of our society and our communities around the capitalist prerogatives of profit-seeking entities. Every day, I see and hear about entire towns, counties, families, and communities around the country that were once promised a prosperous future, now aimlessly wondering what future is left for them after a manufacturer, a coal mine, a call center, a hospital, etc. closed because there was not enough profit to be extracted, or because there was more profit to be had by moving operations elsewhere. And they took the beating economic heart of those communities with them when they left. The jobs, the union memberships, the sense of self-worth, the ability to plant roots and plan for a future, the resources to provide a stable, comfortable life for one's family, the ancillary community gathering spaces that were propped up by people's disposable income and non-work time, all gone in an instant or a relatively short period of time, leaving a gaping void to be filled by low-wage, non-union, less protected, less stable forms of work for most, or reduced staffs working forced overtime under shittier conditions after decades of concessionary bargaining and labor power decline for others. I've heard different versions of this story so often from so many people in so many different parts of the country. And at this point, I genuinely don't know what else it will take for us to acknowledge that this is an absurd, batshit way to organize society, because the needs of capital and the needs of a healthy, flourishing, democratic society, I would argue, are not compatible in the long term. Eventually, the needs of one side will win out over the other, and I think the collapse of the American journalism industry is a case in point. This is an industry whose necessary civic function was fused to the profit-seeking prerogatives of corporate advertisers and to a corporate mindset that shaped the industry itself. And as we have seen, when the corporate side bottomed out, the vestigial appendage of the civic democratic side was dropped like a bad habit. But I want to be very clear, and we should be clear with ourselves, that the corporate capture and the sort of material base of the US journalism industry was already, not entirely, but largely failing to fulfill the essential promise of a free press in a democratic society. Before I go on, I feel like I'm already talking too much, so I can follow up on that later, I guess, and talk about how the Real News is trying to inject our work into that, but I don't want to take up too much time.
No, I mean, that was amazing, and I think we could probably spend the next 45 minutes just sort of following up on everything you said. But Josie, would you mind jumping in and talking a bit about the appeal and some of the other projects you've been a part of and led, sort of in the context of sort of what problems you were responding to or ways of seeing the criminal legal system covered that you sort of wanted to have things counter to?
Sure. So I agree with what both Jay and Maximillian have said so far. And I also just want to say thank you for having us. I was supposed to be there today, but my son has COVID. But I am excited to be here. I'm excited to be here with my Section 6 co-Section 6er, Jay Willis. Same year, same class. Stuck together all these years. So I thought when I was in law school that I would end up doing public defense, or I would do some sort of work in the criminal legal system as a lawyer. I didn't turn out to like the law very much, so I changed my mind. But when I decided to try writing, it really struck me how frankly just terrible coverage of the criminal legal system was. And that was true for a couple of reasons. One of them, like Maximillian just highlighted, is the fact that we don't have much local media anymore. I mean, most local media is gone. Wyoming doesn't have a daily newspaper anymore. That's an entire state, right? I mean, there are places in this country where there is quite literally no oversight mechanism, no free press, quite literally no free press in big swaths of this country. So that makes it really hard to cover local systems, and criminal justice is largely a local system. The second problem I saw was that it's an opaque system, and it's really hard to be able to tell some of these stories if you don't have kind of a legal education or a basic education about the criminal justice system. If this isn't something that you spend all your time thinking about, if you are covering this and business and education and the city council, like, it's very difficult to cover the justice system well and thoroughly and in a way that actually translates to actors in the system that they are being watched, right? As a result, you kind of end up like doing their PR for them most of the time if you cover criminal justice in America. I think the other thing I would say about this is that the obstacles that face people who cover their local police department, their local DA, the sheriff's department, whatever, ICE, like whatever kind of infrastructure that we might be talking about at any given second, the people who cover that are really faced with a difficult conundrum, because very often they need those people to tell other stories. It's very hard to cover the justice. There are not many criminal justice system reporters. They're mostly crime reporters. And it's very hard to cover crime if you piss off the DA or the police chief. It just makes it really difficult to do the rest of what you've been tasked with doing. And so part of the reason we started the appeal was to address some of these problems. Obviously, the appeal was 18,000 different police terms in the country. I think at most we had a staff of 25. So I don't think we were able to kind of do all of it. But what we wanted to do was tell national audiences local stories. And part of the reason we wanted to do that was because we saw trends happening across the country. Something would be happening in Omaha that was also happening in Minneapolis, that was also happening in San Antonio, and nobody really knew it because there wasn't really the infrastructure available to professional journalists, and also there wasn't enough national storytelling to be able to kind of track what trends we were seeing in the system. The second reason we wanted to do we wanted to create the appeal in the way that we did was because we actually knew that we could afford to piss off the DA in San Antonio or Omaha or Minneapolis, because we don't live there and we don't need to report on crime. And so we had kind of an institutional advantage, and we would often hear from local reporters saying like, hey, I can't look into this the way I want, but I'd love for you guys to, et cetera. So we had kind of that in our corner too. And then the third thing I'll say, and then I'll move on, you should move on, is just that one of the things that drove me, that took years off my life because it drove me so crazy about journalism, the criminal legal system, was the passive voice, the refusal to name a name. Someone was prosecuted, someone was wrongfully convicted, you could never tell who did the thing. And a huge thing that we would always say at the appeal was we believed in direct object journalism. If someone did something to someone else, we are going to name who did it and what they did and who is responsible for that decision. Because people started to believe that this was some sort of, it's systemic, obviously, but people drive systems. Systems are made up of people, and there were decisions being made constantly in the criminal legal system that nobody ever had to be accountable for. And so that was a big part of why that was like kind of the other driving force behind us starting the appeal.
Thanks so much, Josie. Sam, before we move on to some other stuff, is there anything sort of that people have said that kind of resonates about getting the flaw started and the kind of intervention you were making? I mean, earlier in other discussions today, people have talked a bit about that, but I want to give you a chance to.
Yeah, thank you. I will very quickly say, just because I feel like I need to, that Sam Rosen and I were also in Section 6, so that's important.
Woo!
But moving on from that, I think it's similar to what everyone said. Like, there was something bugging us when we were thinking of wanting to start this magazine. It really came to life out of Professor Hansen's corporations class, which is a very non-traditional corporations doctrinal class. We spoke a lot about how, why the laws that were in place regulating corporations were in place and who they were actually benefiting. Spoiler, corporations. And for the final for the class, you could either do the normal traditional exam, which was also not traditional, but an exam, or you could write a paper about how corporate law and power are producing some sort of social problem or injustice. And there were some great papers that were written, and we thought, what do we do with them? Because people need to read them, and they're really good. And maybe this would inspire some actual further coverage on these issues that was really grounded in what was going on the ground. And so that's kind of how the magazine was founded and has been operating thanks to the Critical Corporate Theory Lab each semester. And very similarly to what everyone said, it's really trying to push back against something, and that is just the harms of corporate power and corporate law. So I'll be very brief and just leave it at that, but it definitely feels very connected to what other people have already said.
Awesome. Maximillian, I'd love to come back to you and talk a little bit about how everyone's organizations are funded, sort of in the context of the difficult landscape that you laid out so helpfully. I want to talk a lot with all of you about the sort of substance of the work that you do and that you put out, but I think it can be sometimes easy to kind of gloss over the relationship between how, you know, good journalism gets paid for today, and what that journalism sort of looks like substantively. And it seemed to me that you, Maximillian, you were sort of about to maybe talk a little bit about the Real News and your project sort of in that context. So if you want to sort of pick that thread up again, and then of course other panelists feel free to just jump in after Maximillian. Don't wait for me.
Sure, and I'm gonna dispense with the notes and just try to condense here. So, like, I mean, I guess I would start with the obvious. In terms of funding, like, we're all different, like, ships. We're not all in the same boat, but we're like different ships in the same storm. No one has really figured out a sustainable replacement for the advertising-based model of the 20th century, which, as we saw, wasn't even a good model in the first place, right? And so, you know, I kind of tend to agree with Bob McChesney and John Nichols that, like, unless we have like some sort of like massive overhaul that provides like public subsidies for all types of media, like, I don't really see a way out of this that is going to lift all boats. I see a couple lucky people who are going to get enough of a subscriber-based model or angel investors, you know, to prop them up, but those aren't permanent. I left the Chronicle of Higher Education in the middle of a pandemic to come work with all the amazing staff at the Real News. A month after I started, we got a massive funding cut and lost half the staff that I came to work with, right? And so I was like, what the fuck did I just walk into? Sorry, I'm cursing a lot. I got a lot of 5-hour energy in me. But, like, it's not sustainable, like, no matter how good it looks from the outside, for a long-term time. So I think this is a problem that we all have to put our brains together to try to solve. What I would say, and what we say all the time at the Real News, is union journalism is better journalism, cooperative journalism is better, more sustainable journalism, and I think that we should lean into that, support it. We do not need an adversarial relationship between labor and management. They need to be working together, ideally in a sort of collective democratic body, because I believe that not only creates more sustainable institutions, but it creates ultimately better journalism because the journalists who are working there are better protected, so on and so forth. Now, what I would kind of like say, picking up on my last sort of spiel, where I was going with all of this, right, to kind of succinctly sum it up, and I'm going to try to kind of condense, like, you know, 8 years of reading like Neil Postman and media history and theory into like 2 minutes. But like, there was something Neil Postman said that I read like as an early PhD student that really caught my eye in Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he talked about the creation of the telegraph, the commercialization of the telegraph in the 19th century, and what that meant for news media and for news consumers, right? Is where you had, paving in broad strokes here, more localized media markets that catered to predominantly landowning white men, but it was still closer to what I think the founding fathers thought, Alexis de Tocqueville thought, so many people thought the promise of a free press in a democratic society was, which was not just to do what all media or news media say they're doing today, which is to inform people. Whenever people say that, it drives me nuts, because I'm like, to do what? Like, to inform us for what, right? But to inform has sort of become an end of itself, and it is individualized our role as, you know, readers and consumers or what have you of news media. It's just that we are better informed people, but the information we don't have anything to really do with, right? This is what the telegraph really exploded for Postman, right? Is that no longer did you have media markets that were providing at least more usable information for the people who were living in those societies. So like, they were providing information that those people could use to be more effective democratic actors in their societies. This is the ideal scenario, right? But, the more that the telegraph and the 20th century technologies enabled news media in a capitalist system to not only have access to more news from around the country, around the world, but they were in competing media, a media marketplace that was fundamentally capitalist and competitive, and they were seeking, new readers, they inevitably started making those editorial choices of like, what is going to sell more papers? What is going to keep people's attention? What is the more sensationalist headline, the gory story, the yellow journalism, yada, yada, yada. And so that catalyzed, I think, a long brewing process that the corporatization of news media in the United States in the 20th century really carried forward, which was decoupling journalism from that fundamental civic function of empowering people with information, good information, ideally, to be better stewards of democracy, more engaged democratic actors in their society. What instead it made out of us is what consumerism always aims to do, which is to make us good consumers, people who just read, consume, and watch the world burn with 3D glasses, but really don't internalize that information and feel empowered to do anything with it, because we got to keep staying on top of an ever quickening news cycle. And so this is fundamentally fused with those capitalist corporate prerogatives of needing to sell papers, needing to keep ad revenue up, needing to basically jettison the civic function of a free press and replace it, with the need for building and maintaining a more reliable base of consumers, right? And so that's what I think all of us are trying to fight against in our respective ways. At The Real News, what we are trying to do is not just inform people, but to approach people as and activate them, get them involved in the struggles that we're reporting on, provide pathways for them to learn more about it, to know what they can do to help, to do follow-up reporting on labor stories. So I talk to workers every week. We also have great shows like the Police Accountability Report that reports on the violence and victims of the police industrial complex. Rattling the Bars, founded by longtime political prisoner Eddie Conway, does the same for the prison industrial complex. So we're really trying to make good on that promise of not just informing people, but empowering people by lifting up the stories of the people who are already fighting on the front lines and treating our audience not as just passive consumers, but activated or soon to be activated democratic participants in society.
I'll just jump in about the funding question related to what Maximillian just said. Yeah, I think a huge so it is absolutely the case that we have not figured out how to fund journalism, and there is really no good way to fund journalism. It's really hard to fund journalism in general, and it's also really hard to figure out the best kind of theoretical approach, because even the public subsidies approach has a problem, because then you are at the mercy of government subsidies when you are also often criticizing government. And this is this is a public broadcasting system problem, right? This is the NPR problem. This is the issue of any sort of accountability structure that needs outside funding. So at the Appeal, we were funded basically by philanthropy, and that was also a constant source of stress. I mean, Jay was there; he can attest to this. It took up 40% of my time, right? It required us to rely on 3 or 4 very rich people in hopes that they would continue to fund us. And when they didn't, we came up against a real struggle. The time, what media relies on right now is completely unsustainable. I think the main problem here is that, everybody hates media, which same, but we need it, so part of the problem is we're not very popular. Another problem that we really have is that in consuming media and supporting media is not seen as a value in this country. In the way that we tell people to contribute to candidates, nobody ever says, not enough people say your duty in a democracy is to support media, right? This is, to me, and not to be blasphemous, but it is like tithing to me. This is the very basic part of how you have a functional democracy. And if you don't support it, it doesn't exist. And, you know, I'm currently working on a podcast that I just released last week called Unreformed, and a lot of it required me to go back to news articles from the early 1900s, et cetera. We're talking about news articles that covered Black kids in the early 1900s. Like, it wasn't great coverage. It wasn't the sort of coverage you want to see, but it existed. And the fact that it existed gave me tools to go find out what the real story was. And that institution that I'm investigating, I know more about what they were like in 1920 than I do what they were like now, because there was better coverage of them in 1920 than there is now. That is the nature of what we are facing in terms of like the ability not only to predict what's coming, to know what's happening now, but to predict what's coming and to be able to analyze what happened before. So I say that to say that, like, when it comes to funding media, everybody is throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks. Very little is sticking, and it is very, very difficult to rebuild infrastructure once it is gone. Once the local paper is gone, and lots of local papers aren't great, once it's gone, it's very hard to start it up again. It's very hard to do this again. And so this is what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is the fact that you cannot have a functional democracy without a robust free press, and nobody right now is willing to pay for that. Nobody's willing to pay for it. I hear my lawyer friends talking about, can I use your password to whatever? Does anybody have like a password to the X, Y, and Z website? I get it, right? But there's no kind of shame associated with not wanting to pay people to do the dogged work of telling you what the hell is going on in your community all the time. And that is a major part of a functioning society.
I don't have anything to add to both of those great answers. The only thing I will say is, if anyone in the audience has $1 million, I think you look nice today.
It goes to me.
And you should come talk to me after this.
Yeah, I can briefly add, I mean, with the flaw, we're student run, so it's not like we're getting any funding for our work. And that's just really led to our work being so like localized and really based on what people have connections to. Really is like, number one, just the fact of our time is limited. We have other classes, we have other things that we're doing in law school, but just because of the fact that it's not like we're getting any funding from the school to be able to go and, you know, meet with this person who can really provide an interesting perspective on this issue. A lot of it is based on like we're crowdsourcing connections and ideas, which has made the work more difficult, but also really fascinating and enjoyable and creative and collaborative because just the nature of the circumstances. So it's definitely funding's been an issue for us, but in a way it's also been really forcing us to be more creative in the sort of writing that we do.
One thing that seems to be something that kind of unites all of the different work you all do is a kind of maybe a tension between sort of novelty and continuity, in the sense that on the one hand there's sort of an imperative to tell sort of fresh new stories to readers, often daily, but on the other hand the systems that you all write about and cover often produce the same kind of outcomes over and over, whether it's another far-right Supreme Court opinion or another prosecutor bringing felony charges when they could do a dozen other things, or another boss interfering with a unionization effort, or sort of so on and so on. And so I'm curious, I'd love to hear from all of you about sort of whether you feel like that tension is real, and if you do, how you balance that, how you sort of keep telling new stories that are also in some ways kind of the same story.
I'll just say that when I started covering prosecutors in 2015, I at the time I was the only person covering prosecutors nationally, like as a full-time job. And I remember that when I took the job, I was like, how am I going to have enough stories to tell? Like, I have to cover this every single day. And I quickly realized there needed to be, 100 of me. There are the ability, the creativity that these actors and systems have of figuring out new ways to screw people over is remarkable. And I've yet to have a problem where I feel like this is the same story. Surely there are the same themes, but and maybe it's just because I'm like obsessed with this system, but I unfortunately never have felt like I'm sort of I'm just sort of saying the same thing because it's so the same things are happening. The same general things are happening, but the specifics kind of matter. What I will say is that like one thing that we're all doing that I don't know if I would necessarily recommend for people's general happiness in life is covering systems that we hate. We are covering, it's like great. It really must be really great to be like a movie critic or something. I don't know. Like so you're constantly sort of like respect the basic fundamental goals of the thing that you're trying to do, even when you're critical of it. I find the thing that wears me down, frankly, professionally, is my unending ability to still get pissed off about what I'm seeing and not ever get really used to it. And I find that to be kind of a bummer because it would feel it gets to you. It gets to you. This really every single day, when all my stories are about death and harm and cops in prisons, and it's I wish I had, sometimes I'm like, I should have got into pottery or something. That sounds like something I could have, really loved. So I think the thing that I would say grates on me is not that the stories are the same, but that the sentiment is the same, and that what it does to me and emotionally and mentally over time is just you have to really be active about keeping the faith about the potential for a better world, because it can very much seem like it can very much feel out of grasp.
I just want to hard second that. And I think Josie put that beautifully, and it really does wear on you. I'm always really overjoyed when workers win, or cover some ground, but it does hurt week in, week out to be there, be present, be attentive, and hear from so many people so often how much pain living in this country causes, how much pain people experience on the job, and then to edit and direct the work of people who are focusing on the pain caused by an unaccountable police system or prison industrial complex or imperialist capitalist war machine, so on and so forth. And what I would also say, though, in that vein, is I feel like I kind of hit the jackpot when I struck, on the idea of doing my podcast, Working People, 4 or 5 years ago, because in my mind, I was like, I'm never going to run out of content, because as I find every week, every time I talk to another worker for that podcast, for my book, for the Real News, everyone has a unique and interesting story to tell. I am always, blown away by, where these conversations go and how much I learn about other people and myself and other parts of the country just by doing the patient, tender work of listening, right? And so I would encourage everyone else to do that. And I do want to highlight that we are also all doing this in community with other hardworking folks, but there frankly are not enough of us, right? So I'm honored to be in community with hardworking labor journalists like Kim Kelly, Luis Feliz Leon, Sarah Jaffe, Michelle Chen, all of these folks who are really working their butts off. But, again, look around you, right? It's union density is at its lowest point. Wealth inequality is through the roof. We have so much work to do, and we are running out of time because the same corporate vampires who are destroying life as we know it are also destroying the planet that we all depend on. So we'll save that for another time. But what I would also say is that it's not just about figuring out how to tell the story differently or more compellingly, because there you're also still working within the confines and incentive structures of a digital media ecosystem that is itself thoroughly corporatized, that is itself driven by prerogatives that are fundamentally antithetical to movement building, to community building, to long-term commitment to struggles like the labor movement, like the climate justice movement, so on and so forth. So what really the Herculean task that I think we all have is, again, sort of, uncoupling ourselves from that sort of like corporate hard wiring that has made us such good consumers and capitalist subjects over the course of our entire lives, and try as best we can to use storytelling, to use media, to lift up voices, and to think about how to present that information and get people engaged in these stories in a more sustained way that is calibrated to a different timeline than that of the capitalist, mainstream media news cycle, right? And the one example I would give there, and then I promise I'll shut up, is like the railroad coverage that we did at the Real News last year. The first interview that I did about that was this time last year, when literally like no one cared about the story. I learned that 17,000 engineers and conductors had a strike blocked at BNSF Railway by a district court judge. And BNSF is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is owned by Warren Buffett. The corporate vampires are everywhere, right? And so I kept doing follow-up interviews with railroad workers. And if I was a better editor-in-chief, I probably would have said, let's go with something that's going to get more traffic, because no one was really watching it. Or like 1,000 to 2,000 people would watch the video, a couple thousand more would listen to the podcast, a couple more would read the transcript, so on and so forth. But I kept doing it because it was important, and because no one was talking to these workers or hearing their plights, right? And really trying to understand the complexity of the issue. But then in September, when we were like days away from a national rail shutdown, suddenly the mainstream media and politicians in DC started giving a shit. And then people had a ready archive of hours and hours of worker interviews and testimonies to inform themselves about what was going on and to help counter the corporate narrative about what the issue really was. And then people started calling me, my colleague Mel Buer, and we were able to bring workers on to interviews with us and force their voices into the discourse. So like, I don't have a lot of like great examples to say, hey, we did what we were trying to do, but I think that's one. And I think that, we can build on that, but it's going to take all of us.
I think I was smiling at your description of the need for novelty in media, because that's one of the hardest parts about writing about an institution like the Supreme Court right now, is that there are only so many different ways you can say the conservatives dunked all over the liberals again and they wrote a pretty upset dissent that doesn't matter. And just like in a news ecosystem, that's a really hard thing, because if your beat is the Supreme Court, what you're doing is you're reading an opinion and then you are pitching your editor on an angle. And yeah, as a writer, you don't want to be pitching what feels like a stale idea to you, which is how we occasionally get these articles, right, that are like, Brett Kavanaugh striking moderate tone every time he like comes down a shade to Samuel Alito's left, right? Like, but surprise, once we get to a voting rights case, it comes down 6-3 every time. I think that the way to avoid writing about institutions like the Supreme Court, to avoid writing about it in a way that feels stale, is to write about cases and write about the evolution of the law that the Supreme Court is pushing, not through a jurisprudential lens, not through an academic lens, but through a lens of the people whose lives the court's decisions are affecting. I think that, think about maybe some of the mainstream, I hate words like that, they can be tricky, but for lack of a better term, establishment news recaps of like the Dobbs opinion, right? How many of those did you read that talked about the impact on women and people who can become pregnant? Third to last paragraph, fourth to last paragraph? In my view, coverage that talks about the court's anti-choice bent, that doesn't have that in the introduction, in the first couple paragraphs, is a failure. Media that talks about a decision like Brnovich without leading with how that impacts mostly Navajo Native communities in Arizona is a failure. Talking about Shelby County without talking about the millions of mostly black people who are disenfranchised throughout the South is a failure. The good news is that it's not that hard to do it. I think if Balls and Strikes has proved anything, it's that like any idiot can write about this. Thank you, I appreciate that. Those details about plaintiffs, petitioners, right? The people whose lives are affected, that's out there. It's just not primarily what legal reporters are drawn to. They view their jobs as explaining the law, which is, largely perceived as inaccessible to folks who aren't lawyers. And so they tend to talk about things in terms of ideology, jurisprudential approach. There's a word that's on the tip of my tongue that's not coming to me. I'll remember it in 5 minutes, it's fine. But they don't talk about it in terms of how it affects real people. And that's just how I would suggest centering these narratives.
Yeah, and just to briefly add for what comes to mind with the flaw, it's really interesting because each semester there's a new group of students who come in and they're motivated because they're interested in talking about how corporate power and law are both messed up. But they come in with these ideas in their head of like something's bothering them, like something that they're seeing in the world is bothering them, and they feel like it's connected to a corporation somehow. And so, having been in the critical corporate theory lab since the beginning, I've been amazed by each time someone coming in with an idea that you're kind of like, whoa, I didn't think about, number one, the corporate connections to that issue or that angle you're bringing up. And I think it's also in trying to bring in different viewers, different readers who might be like, oh, this is something new and different and exciting. It's really pushed us to think about different forms of content. So while we've primarily been, at least right now, what's up has been like medium, longish form journalism. We've been expanding into like podcasting, which like to come, and like writing like actual profiles on these corporate attorneys that you hear and you're like, they sound fine, but you actually really don't know that much about what they're really doing and how bad it is. And so I just, through my work with Flaw, I've noticed that there's just kind of unending stories to tell and different angles and threads and narratives to pull out. And so while it feels like, oh, we're coming to this overarching theme, for instance, Lisa writing about the corporate origins of conservative legal thought, and then I write about common good constitutionalism, like we're able to at least kind of like write our pieces in conversation with each other and build a narrative that way, but then we're also telling completely different stories that are kind of bringing out new ideas that haven't been written about in other pieces before. And so I think also the perspective of just the student authors and what they're bringing and like what's coming to mind for them, it feels like everything feels so fresh, even though we are at root talking about the same problem.
Thank you so much for all those answers. I know we don't have a ton of time, and I'm wondering if anyone has a question they want to ask. Oh, yes, right here.
I wonder with respect to state Supreme Courts, whether anybody is covering that, because we know there are people who are paying very careful attention, and those are the right-wing corporate interests who are, trying to wear away at any, remaining vestige of, product liability law or something like that would, actually hold corporations accountable. But so they know when, what the state Supreme Courts are doing. Anybody at all covering that? Because these are totally invisible, I think, to most people.
Great question. Balls and Strikes does occasionally, but there are folks who are doing it. Josie and my former colleague, Daniel Nishanian at Bolt, does a great job with this, focuses primarily on state legislatures, state Supreme Courts. We've all sort of continued to work together on some of this. And he's taken, he has sort of the advantage that Josie talked about with the appeal, which is that he can speak to a national audience about state Supreme Courts without necessarily fear of getting on anyone's bad side. But I have seen that as the forum for a lot of legal conflict shifts to state Supreme Courts, that the legal journalism industry is also sort of bringing coverage up that they had not previously built out.
Yeah, I chuckled because I'm always I'm just always telling Jay the long-term balls and strikes plan is for him to also cover every other court in the country alone. So soon Jay will also be covering all the state Supreme Court stuff too. But I think that I feel particularly obsessed with the state Supreme Court stuff too because it doesn't get a lot of national coverage. I do think that they're in different states, there are particular people who are much better at covering, for example, in Wisconsin, in North Carolina. Like you do see some pretty good state Supreme Court coverage in those places, but there isn't kind of that national coverage. I think this leads me to just say that one of the other problems with journalism is that it requires more collaboration than we currently are very good at doing, and that a good thing that everybody there can do is when you see something crazy out of a state Supreme Court or you think there's a story, to send it to us or to whoever, just because what you're doing is building a record. You're building a base of knowledge. If they don't cover that one, they might cover the next one. So I just would encourage people, to when you have an issue that you think doesn't get enough coverage, to send some unsolicited emails. That's not advice I've ever given anybody, to send unsolicited emails, but this is a good reason.
Well, and just two really quick rapid fire things before we break. Like, I just wanted to impress upon everyone what you probably already know, right, is that this is class war as well, right? Because the corporatization of the journalism industry and the subsequent sort of bottoming out of that industry when it was no longer, serving the prerogatives of those corporate seeking entities has translated to continued immiseration and disempowerment of working people in their local communities. Take one example of our shows, the Police Accountability Report. Stephen Janice and Taya Graham do the kind of investigative work that is designed to hold unaccountable police departments and police officers accountable to the communities that they're ostensibly there to serve when they abuse their power. But as the local news media ecosystem has sort of bottomed out, and as the sort of like corporate desiccation of the remaining newsrooms has continued unabated, right? You don't have reporters who are able to do that work. So thereby they lazily regurgitate the press releases from police departments. We all know like what that leads to, right? It provides cover for people doing awful things, yada, yada, yada. And so who are the ones who suffer from that? Working people on their way to work who are harassed by these cops, pulled over repeatedly, imprisoned, yada, yada, yada. Same goes for bad bosses in these communities, rampant wage thieves, tyrannical landlords, all the people who are at the top of these local hierarchies who are allowed to continue to mistreat working people without any real accountability from a public institution like the free press. So we all have a stake in this. And what I would also say on a positive note is that those of us who are in this realm, those of us who are trying as best we can to counteract these forces, I think what's really exciting is we are not seeing each other in those corporate capitalist terms. I don't see anyone here as a competitor. I hear about this work and I want to collaborate. I want to work together. I want to offer whatever we have to lift up this great work and the great work that's going on elsewhere. So I would just stress to everyone, find people who are doing good work with them, lift them up. No one can do everything here, but we can all do something to make this better.
Wow. Well, Professor Hanson, do we have time for one more question? If not, I mean, that would be a pretty great note to end on. So I feel like it's a win-win. But right on. Well, please, Jay.
Can I sneak one plug in conjunction with my comments earlier about how any idiot can do this? Strongly encourage anyone in the audience who feels the same way that we've all been talking about corporate legal media. You should be pitching balls and strikes. You should write for us. I get pitches from law students all the time. Some of them are good. Many of them have gone up on the site. I really would love to hear from you. The other thing, this sounds like a joke, dead serious. You guys are familiar with, broadly speaking, the story of Moby Dick. Captain Ahab has a white whale. I have a white whale. If anyone in this audience knows how much Noah Feldman gets paid for his Bloomberg columns, I want to know about it. Please find me after this. Let's talk about it. Thanks.
I don't even know the story of Moby Dick, but I knew where that was going. I just want to say really quickly that talking to this group of people, because we are fighting systems a lot, I can seem, people are we believe that, I believe that this can change and that there is the potential for such a better world. And I think of what we're doing as creation, not destruction, as trying to build something better. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be doing it. So as soon as I said, like, this work is really depressing, I realized that I don't want to make everybody think that it's purely depressing, because it's also a gift to be able to kind of be in a place where doing this kind of journalism and doing this kind of investigation and pushing on these systems can happen. And I don't take for granted that that is not an option everywhere or for everybody. And so I just say that to say that, like, I don't think anybody here is hopeless, right? Or we wouldn't be trying this. I think all of us are actually pretty optimistic of a better future if we keep pushing forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for this conversation. This was awesome.